Hello. Today I'm going to be reading you Taming Zane in the Almost Perfect series, Book 2 by Lisa Lanay, presented to you by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Shannon stowed her carried-on bag in the airplane's overhead compartment and then sank into her seat with a sigh of relief. It was a window seat, and so far she was the only one seated in a row. 15 minutes until takeoff. Perhaps her luck would hold out, and she would have the whole row to herself. The latest bestseller in her hand, a blanket in her lap, and a halfway decent movie was more than enough to entertain her for the 4-hour trip from Chicago to San Francisco. As long as they didn't expense turbulence, and even the thought of a bumpy ride sent panic from her stomach to her toes. The long flight she had dreaded earlier may not be so bad after all. She had little time in her life to curl up with a good book. Then, even on an airplane, it was a welcome reprieve from her normal hectic schedule. Mom, over here. I found our seat. There's a lady sitting by the window. You said I could sit by the window. A hurried-looking woman with a squirming toddler balanced on her hip traveled several feet behind a rambunctious little boy. Hold on, honey. Don't put anything down yet. Let's turn around, and I will speak with the flight attendant. Maybe there's a chance we can get a row to ourselves. Shannon released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, until the moment her lungs exhaled in relief. Mother, son, and baby, cramped into 2 seats next to me? No. There had to be some vacant rows still open in the large plane. She turned in her seat to make a quick scan of the rows behind her, and her hopes of the enjoyable trip vanished. Come on, please let there be an open row for them. She clutched the seat's armrest, and discreetly as she could, with her neck craned to a 100-degree angle, she watched the flight attendant seat her would-be travel companion several rows behind her. Whew! Was that close? Glad that mini-crisis was averted. She giggled to herself. She loved kids, but not on planes, and when they weren't her own. She preferred not to be crammed into a small space with them. She was reminded of her own son, who was leaving for Disney World that evening with her parents. She grabbed her cell phone quickly and called him, and just as quickly stopped herself short. Ethan had promised to remain within grandparents' sights at all times, especially at the parks, and in return, she had agreed not to constantly check up on him. She was determined to live up to her end of the bargain, even if it practically killed her to do it. Shannon stared at her cell phone screen for several seconds before she turned it off and placed it inside her purse. Eager to get comfortable again for a long flight, she snuggled deep into her seat and picked up her book. Hopefully there won't be anyone in the middle seat. That would be nice. Startled to hear a voice that seemed to come from next to her, Shannon's eyes flew up from the pages of her book. She turned her head, and to her shock, she found herself gazing into a pair of eyes the color of the sky on a clear summer day. And they happened to be in a very attractive face of a man seated in the aisle seat of her row, a mere 2 seats away. She recalled him in the gate area earlier and thinking he was attractive, but now, up close and next to her, she realized he was smoking hot. She could definitely have to thank this flight attendant for making the switch in the seating arrangements. Yeah, me too. Discreetly as she could, with her mouth gaping open, she checked out her new row companion from head to toe. Oh, wow. Not only were those baby blues to die for, but they were part of a face that could not have been any better if it were on the cover of her now forgotten book. Dark, thick eyebrows slashed across the forehead that was creased with the faintest of wrinkles. Okay, so his good looks placed him in the same age group as some of her handsome male students, the ones who left their female companions in tears at least once during the college semester. Still, it wasn't as if she was going to jump the guy's bones. She just planned on admiring him for a few hours. What was the harm in that? Besides, she had already been down that road years ago and had a broken heart to prove it. She had almost 8 years to learn from her bad judgment in men, and she had no plans to repeat the experience. In her opinion, great-looking guys always cause nothing but trouble. "I think boarding is done," he returned with a grin. "I'd really appreciate an uneventful flight, although I overheard a flight attendant say that we might experience some bumps along the way." "Yes, I heard that also. Unfortunately, I'm not a big fan of turbulence." She shot him a slight smile, and immediately her cheeks burned to a bright pink. Oh, how lean could she get? She brought her lower lip between her teeth. "Can't you think of anything more interesting to say than your fear of turbulence?" She straightened in her seat and widened her smile. Was there really a great-looking guy making small talk seated in the same row with her, and with no wedding ring in sight? Her current circumstances were way better than the plot in the book she had disregarded moments ago. A zing of excitement shot through her, despite the warning bells ringing loud and clear inside her head. It's a non-stop flight to San Francisco," she finally added, and then stifled a groan that rose in her throat. So much for him finding her to be an interesting conversationalist. You sure blew that one, Shannon. She tried to tear her eyes away from him, but they seemed to be stuck in place. She watched him place the battered backpack under the seat in front of him, without much regard to its contents, before he buckled the safety belt around his trim waist. The fabric of his black t-shirt clung to his thick arms and chest, before it disappeared into a pair of faded jeans. Shannon pulled her lower lip between her teeth again, and then swallowed nervously as she continued to stare at him. He sat back in his seat, and her gaze remained fixed on him as he turned his head towards her with a smile on his generous lips. "I don't know if I could take another connection. My trip from Kilimanjaro had enough connections to last me a very long time." Shannon tore her gaze from what she saw was tiny gray strands mixed in with the rest of charcoal hair to stare back at him. "You flew to Chicago from Kilimanjaro?" Her eyes widened and her brows arched over them, high over her forehead. She had always wanted to travel to foreign countries, but taking care of an active 7-year-old and working a full-time job that often required 60 hours a week kept her from sometimes going to the grocery store most days, let alone traveling abroad. Her new row companion flipped through the airline magazine before he placed it on the seat between the two of them, and she noticed that his fingers were long, his nails buffed to a dull sheen. Okay, so she's seen more rugged hands on a guy, but really, who was she to judge? The guy cared about his appearance, better than grease stains under his nails, she reasoned. "I left 2 days ago, and after numerous delays and a few senseless connections, here I am, finally, one flight away from San Francisco and home." "Kilimanjaro. Wow," she whispered, in more than a whisper. "Were you there on business?" "I guess you could call it that." His eyes were pensive and shrugged. "Excuse me a second." He said another quick smile to her direction before he turned to capture the attention to the passing flight attendant. "Hi there, any chance of an extra magazine?" Shannon saw him flash the flight attendant a brilliant smile, and based on her glowing reaction, Shannon bet the woman would return with a whole stack of magazines and then offer to sit in his lap and read it to him. "Why, sure, Time or Newsweek, okay?" came her reply in a sultry tone that Shannon knew she had not used with the passenger seated behind them when he asked the same question only minutes ago. "I bet this guy flashes those hypnotizing eyes all the time," she mused. Sure, he was totally unaware of the powerful effect he had on women. Irritation flared within her as she watched their exchange with something akin to envy, right before she realized that she would have retrieved the magazine for him herself if he'd asked her. "How about something lighter? People, perhaps. I've had enough real world to keep me going for a while." He returned the flight attendant's gaze with another dazzling smile. "Sure thing, sugar. I'll be right back." The flight attendant held his gaze, which made her interest in him more than obvious. "Thanks, darling." "Sugar? Darling? All right," she admitted. The flight attendant had one of those cute southern accent you couldn't fake without sounding ridiculous. But really, sugar and darlin'? He had just called her darlin', and she appeared to bask in the endearment, giggling like a schoolgirl when she walked away. Shannon started to roll her eyes upward and stopped herself. What was going on with her? The guy was obviously a natural charmer, and even though she had been seated next to him for less than 5 minutes, she had already staked her claim on him. Prepared to warn any potential competition to back off, wait, hadn't she just reminded herself that hot guys were off limits to her? Hadn't she just mentally reprimanded herself? Yes, about 5 minutes ago and counting, and this time she did roll her eyes. Sorry about that. What was I saying? He turned and his attention was focused on her again. Oh man, no wonder the flight attendant had giggled. A pair of dimples winked at her from the opposite corners of his mouth, and she had to stop herself from reaching out and touching each one with her fingertips. You were about to explain to me why you were in Kilimanjaro. How could one man be so handsome? It just wasn't fair. She'd take a guy with half his looks and be content for the rest of her life. Okay, maybe not half, but close enough, she thought, in case Cupid and the staff took mercy and listened to her thoughts. You're right, good memory. Anyway, I'm a plastic surgeon, specializing in reconstructive surgery. He replied with a shrug. I donate at least a few weeks of the year in third world or war-torn countries during what I can do to help medically. This time it was an area about 45 miles outside of Kilimanjaro. Oh, wow, Shannon replied when she could finally find her voice. How did she respond to that one? Did she praise him for such a noble contribution to society? Or did she try to impress him with some comment about Kilimanjaro? But what about Kilimanjaro? In fact, where was Kilimanjaro? It was no small wonder that years ago, her college advisor strongly suggested she'd swap out global study class for a psych class before she had a chance to flunk out. With a slight shake of her head, she gladly diverted her attention from her limited world knowledge back to the gorgeous man next to her, a reconstructive surgeon who donated his time to victims in third world countries with a face and a body to kill for. Was this some type of practical joke? This guy was too good to be true, and he was seated next to her for the next 4 hours. No way. Nothing like this ever happened to her. Not her, not Shannon McGregor. Over the last several years, she had endured endless hours of girlfriends bragging about wonderful guy they met at work or at a health club or on a train or wherever else gorgeous hunks seemed to hang out, which seemed to be everywhere she was not. Actually, though, she hated to admit it, most of those friends were now married to those alleged hunks. Meanwhile, she spent her life as a college professor, meeting men either so young they called her ma'am or so old they referred to her as a youngster. She had finally met someone exciting enough to brag about her girlfriends, even if her time with him was only the duration of a plane flight. How did you decide on Kilimanjaro? I mean, nothing against Kilimanjaro, she quickly added. I was just wondering how you know where you are needed. Great. He probably thinks I'm now a country bumpkin who hasn't been out of her hometown, which was not the far from the mark. Outside of traveling to nearby Wisconsin on family vacations, she rarely left Chicagoland area. This flight was her first one over 6 years, and although she considered Chicago one of the most interesting cities in the world, according to her very biased opinion, it was only one city in the world of thousands, most of which she never visited. She watched him chuckle under his breath, and she thought he must have heard the question numerous of times before in the past. Actually, Kilimanjaro found me. I'm listed in a database of doctors willing to volunteer for extended international assignments. I'm single and I don't have any family ties. Fortunately, I might add. He stopped to chuckle. Hi, my time is my own time. Typically, a group of us go together as a team in medical professions, often as part of the same team every year. I and several doctors and nurses spend most of the year on staff for various hospitals throughout the country and are provided with flexibility to leave with duty calls. The hospitals typically don't mind a good PR, although it was an explanation he had probably recited often. Shannon picked up on the passion in his voice and saw the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of his volunteer work. I think it's amazing that each of you is willing to do that where you are needed. That's wonderful and very commendable. She tried to volunteer for numerous charities causes. She even donated blood regularly, but she sure didn't travel to foreign countries to save the world. Thanks, he said. All right, and that is where I'm going to leave off. You guys